I had a really meaningful walk with a friend one day who I was trying to convince to quit her job. And there was like definitely an aha moment where I was explaining these biases to her. I was explaining sort of like what might be at play because she was really trying to quit and she just couldn't like bring herself to quit.
Mind Hack is a podcast about the psychology of performance, behavior change, and self-optimization. Each episode explores how to think better, work smarter, and live more intentionally through conversations with top thinkers, entrepreneurs, and scientists. Welcome to the Mind Hack Podcast, where we explore the psychology of self-improvement and mindset to help you live a happier and more fulfilled life. You know, we're always looking for better answers in life, how to find more success, more happiness, more meaning. But what if we're approaching this whole thing backward? What if the problem isn't that we haven't found the right answers, but we've been asking the wrong questions? Today, I'm joined by Vicki Tan, a product designer whose career spans some of tech's most innovative companies, including Google, Spotify, Headspace. Vicki operates at the fascinating intersection of design, mental health, technology, and human behavior. She's also the author of the cleverly titled book, Ask This Book a Question, a book that flips our conventional wisdom upside down by not just challenging us to seek the answers, but to examine the very questions that we're asking in the first place. So if you're ready to shift your perspective and maybe finally find the right answer, then let's dive in. Vicki, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
So before we dive into your book, I'd love to know more about your journey as a product designer going from Google, Spotify, Headspace, like so many incredible companies, to now writing a book about decision making.
Yeah, can you believe it? I even have work experiences before that. Well, I studied behavioral science. I always start off by saying that. In college, I studied that. I like to joke that I had a pigeon named John for my behavioral science class, where we put them in the Skinner box and taught them how to do little things like turn in a circle. So that was my origins just in behavioral science. So I've always found that to be, just the most interesting topic. But I graduated during the recession, and it felt like I also don't know what job you would do if you just had an undergrad in behavioral science. So I found it hard to find a job when I graduated. And so I thought about going back to school. I ended up working in research labs for a few years just to gain experience. And that meant I was working in hospitals at Stanford University, at UCSF, just like facilitating research studies on these fascinating topics like pulmonology, pediatric oncology. Like I have a weird wealth of medical knowledge now that people are always surprised about. But fast forward to living in Silicon Valley, working in research labs. I think you see everyone working in tech. It feels a little envious because it's a different lifestyle to go in and work in a cubicle with Folgers versus to work on a big tech campus. But I got lucky and a friend referred me into a pretty random position at Google. I don't even know what it was. But I ended up getting picked for a different position where we were trying to think about how to hire and how to build teams for long-term success. A type of organizational psychology that Google became more well-known for, I think, when Laszlo Bock wrote his book about work. I forgot what it was called. So while I was at Google, I learned about design and I ended up using my 20% time. I'm not sure if they have it anymore, but I kind of self-taught into design and kind of just jumped from startup to startup every 2 years. I joke about a 2-year lease where I, reconsider at the end of 2 years if this is the right job for me. Yeah, I moved from Google to Lyft. It was early days. I don't know if you're familiar with Lyft in San Francisco early days. They had like pink mustaches. I started working there when it was a tip-only system with the little balloons that you would set the start and stop or the pick up and drop off. And then moved on to Headspace earlier days too, when Andy was still in the office leading group meditations for us. That was kind of a special time, I think, when companies are sub 200 and you can know every single employee. I really like that period. And then, I think I kept searching for more exciting consumer-facing opportunities. What I really loved at Headspace was there was a behavioral science team. So I got to see what it kind of looked like to take what I knew from school, which felt like a long time ago, and then bring it back in towards the design career that I was building. And so that was a really nice pairing where, we were creating onboarding flows or sort of emotional check-in flows that use things like CBT, or there's something called the circumplex model of emotion that helps you map your emotion on different dimensions. So it's fun to actually use that in product design, which most designers, I won't say most designers don't do, but we tend to just look at design patterns, design language, and a different set of tools. So after Headspace, I left there and I actually started working on this book, but more in a picture book format, a movable book that was meant to feel almost like a children's book. And I think it was around then when the pandemic happened and everything kind of lost footing, and I ended up losing steam on the book, and I ended up taking another full-time job at Spotify, which was a great way to find stability during the pandemic. And then when I got laid off from Spotify, I thought, well, no better time than now to pick up the book. And I was living in New York at the time. And there's just so many people doing their own thing out there. The literary community is out there. And I had a really meaningful walk with a friend one day who I was trying to convince to quit her job. And there was definitely an aha moment where I was explaining these biases to her. I was explaining sort of what might be at play, because she was really trying to quit and she just couldn't bring herself to quit. It wasn't until I sat down and cooked her this meal of mapo tofu and kind of told her that when I quit my job, this is what really, whether it was mentally or financially or sort of in terms of decision fatigue, that I felt was what helped me be on my own for a year. That really clicked for her. And that ended up being the core part of the book, which is the stories. So I never imagined writing if you've read some of the stories, they end up being more personal. I never thought that I would put personal stories into a book about decision making, because I'm not so confident to say I've made all the right decisions. And I think I said Lindsay my agent was such an instrumental partner in coming up with the book concept. But yeah, just having the reinforcement of someone saying, actually, I like reading this little story of yours. So that ended up, being my second sabbatical after Spotify. And then as soon as I turned in the manuscript, writing a book is lonely. I don't know if you can relate to that, but I ended up getting another tech job where I am now at Pinterest, just because I missed collaborating with really smart, creative people who are there to work with you and to bounce ideas off of. So the book is coming out in 2 weeks. And it's been a bit of a juggle to try to do full-time work and kind of PR and marketing, but something everybody should try, I think.
I love that story. It seems like you went from just focusing on organizational behavioral science or psychology, and then getting into design, and then bringing that what you've learned about psychology into design. And then I remember seeing a bit of your talk in relation to Headspace, and that just made me think just how instrumental Headspace trying to have this positive impact on bringing more mindfulness to society. And, Headspace has been awarded just in terms of the overall design. And of course, we all know that all of these products and companies and apps have their user flows and journeys, and, optimizing it There's something I remember speaking to a former product designer at Facebook. And one thing that she just really loved is that, maybe you're just focusing on like colors or, a specific page, but that your work is going to impact millions and millions of people. It's going to be seen around the world, even if your name's not attached to it. And so being able to have that impact. And what you said about bringing the behavioral science into the product design, it's almost like the opposite of dark patterns, that is kind of associated where you intentionally design a product to drive a user to perform an action that's against their self-interest, their own interest. It's more in line with what the company wants. And so you might see yourself, I see what you've been doing is kind of the opposite of that. So I just coined this idea of maybe you're like a life designer. I love the book and that, it's not just this regular book that's, as we were talking earlier, that you just read in a linear fashion. It's, as you say, this design, like pick your own adventure. And so your book, you argue that we end up spending our lives like chasing answers to questions when we should really be spending that time finding what questions should we be asking. So I'd love for you to explain that a little bit more and what you mean by that.
Yeah, and I'll just add one thing to what you said, because I love how you framed, it's always nice to hear what people think you're up to. And that was just the most generous interpretation. If you listen to some of the talks later on as I get more experience, I really tried to advocate for something I call umami metrics. Like if you know anything about how tech companies make decisions, it's through metrics. And this is one of the decision-making through lines. And the metrics are all very straightforward. Like, are you active on a daily basis? Are you active on a monthly basis? That, they call them DAO and MAO. And are you clicking through? Are you making a purchase? And things like that you can easily capture, but I don't think are meaningful for people. Are you a subscriber for month after month? And I really tried to socialize this idea of an umami metric, which is like a little bit more qualitative. Like, it's sort of akin to if somebody was like smart on paper or successful or any other of the like easy to measure things, but they weren't great to be around, or they aren't they don't have a high EQ, or they aren't like kind or sort of contributing to whatever it is their circle is. And so I tried to make the case even at Headspace for us to have something like life quality or happiness or satisfaction, because even a company like Headspace, at least at the time, didn't have any of those metrics. It was still the same one. Just echoing, I like the idea that like designers can bring more positivity into product design, at least with something like behavioral science to combat some of the dark patterns. But your question was around, why should we pay attention more to questions rather than the answers? Will you say it again?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like that we have these questions in mind and we're just trying to seek the answers, whether it's just trying to achieve happiness or I'm trying to achieve a certain goal. And yet your book as a whole, it seems to argue that instead of focusing on finding answers to questions that we might already have, that we would be better spent and trying to find out what are the right questions to be asking instead of just focusing our time on seeking the answers.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this is the part where the biases sort of come in as the background of everything. All of the biases are helping us try to take action, to find certainty, to like feel clarity in a world that feels flooded with information, sensory input. Like if you just look around your setting right now, unless you have noise canceling, there's probably so much visual input. There should be some sound, probably tactile. Like there's so much happening, and the way that we can focus in and just be here talking to each other are a type of filtering that our mind is doing. I guess I just feel like we're primed to want to have this like simple clarity of like, okay, this is reality. This is it. Like, give me the answer, give me simplicity so I can sort of rest and be I don't know, be at peace in my certainty. And what that does is it doesn't give you any space to like examine or understand what is happening automatically. I think there's probably a Viktor Frankl quote about the space in between stimulus and response, but all of that, I would argue mindfulness even kind of tries to get at that. But the idea that you can live in the space in between where you are and where you want to be, which might be the answer or certainty or something, I think becoming comfortable with that is acknowledging that like, even when you reach the answer that you think is the answer, you may not even be there. So I think that there's so much emphasis on the latter part. I wanted to help people kind of slow down and appreciate the former part a little bit more.
There's some quote that's a great therapist doesn't give you the answers, but they ask the right questions. I would love if you can share an example or a perspective in relation to what kinds of questions should somebody be asking, or what kinds of things have you seen in your work and focus and study on this that people are where people are getting it wrong.
Yeah, and I try to be clear in the book. I don't think there's any wrong questions or right questions, which is why it's, ask this book any question. But what I do try to help you understand is whatever question you've come with, I try to help you expand the texture or the scope or your understanding of that question. So you might have come with a simple yes or no question. Should I, yes or no, quit my job? Should I move to whatever city? Should I adopt a dog? And a lot of what we were talking about in the introduction, kind of trying to prime you to go one level or two levels or even three levels beyond that question to try to interrogate like, well, if this was a straightforward thing for you, you wouldn't be here with the question kind of stuck or ruminating on it. And so, yeah, the first part of the book is about expanding like this understanding of the question. And it could be by the end of those pages, you do have a different question, but I don't have a strong point of view on if there's right or wrong questions. I think if it's something you're struggling with, then it's perfectly valid.
Perhaps if I were to tag on to your example of somebody's asking themselves, should I quit my job? They might default to, well, I'm not getting enough money that maybe I think I deserve more money, or I can get more money elsewhere. Or maybe there's some aspect about the social environment that they might not like. But maybe if I were to look at this, it would be perhaps what's an inverse question? How would I feel if I continued to have this job in 5 years? What is the meta component of this question? What is the underlying feeling that's causing me to even ask this question of should I quit my job? I suppose in one way, I think that what you're advocating in the book as a whole is trying to be kind of multi-dimensional or multimodal, I think is another word here. If you is teaching a person that if you have a question, to then ask yourselves, what are the surrounding questions? And I know that, and before we started this recording, you showed me this brilliant Figma page that just showed the amount of intense dedication and work that you put into designing this user journey and this flow of the book. And I think in one way, it's looking at these big questions that we end up having coming through our lives. Should I marry this person? Is this person right for me? Is this job right? Is this the right thing for me? And being able to step back and ask, what are the related questions to this before just trying to dig into that main one?
Yeah, exactly. And I guess that's the first step of slowing down, which is expanding the question. It is a classic double diamond in design, which is, there's something you want to solve. You kind of go broad first before you narrow in. I won't say selfishly, but selfishly, I asked you to do that to prime you for what the rest of the book is trying to do, which is teach you about cognitive bias. Without that broadening part, I think if I just shot you over, if your question was, should I quit my job? And I shot you over to the sunk cost effect or something to do with mental accounting, if it's the money you're concerned with, or, I could probably list off if it's money versus time versus coworkers. I could probably send you to a bias straight away, but it would mimic that interaction that I told you about with my friend, where I was just trying to tell her the information and it wasn't landing, because it's not the information that changes behavior. It's like this emotional resonance. It's something really clicking with where someone is in their life in that moment. And so I kind of felt like if I could expand that, like first help someone like loosen this question they've probably thought a lot about already. Like it's probably stuck because, or they're struggling with it because there's no easy answer. And so if I presume that I have, like, there's no way I could answer everyone's question right off the bat. And in fact, you'll notice that in the book, I don't really use, I think I don't use the word answer a single time, or the word right, because it's not really about that, I forget who the quote is from, but it's some guy who is talking about how he has a task to do. It's like mailing an envelope, and he goes on this long journey in New York City as he's walking to the post office, and all the things that happen on the way, of course, in a big city like that. He runs into someone, he sees this thing, he does that. And the journey he takes is why he's running that errand or something. He phrases it in a different way, but I kind of like that idea, which is like, your question is just like this starting point that we can begin a larger conversation. And getting to the answer is sort of, I don't want to say the book won't give you an answer, but the answer isn't the end point. It's everything along the way. And if you're kind of leaning into that, if you're luxuriating in everything you're learning, you might just let go of the idea of reaching the answer. Or maybe you'll come into knowing like the direction you should go.
I kind of just had like something, a little light bulb pop in my head when you were mentioning your friend and, having this question, should she quit her job? And you were giving her the answer. And I think we've all had this experience where we have a close friend or family member experiencing some kind of emotional distress or pain. And then we default to wanting to give them the answer, right? Because it's super easy to give somebody else the answer when there's no consequence to the end result on you. And yet we find that they're always super unhelpful. And now we have things where relational science is teaching us, like Gottman, that you should be asking, well, do you want to be, if you're truing or giving your significant other some kind of emotional distress, do you want validation or do you want them to help you resolve it? And like 90% of the time, we just want validation. We just want to feel heard. And what I find interesting is that, so I went to South by Southwest here in Austin recently, and I've seen tons of talks, and a lot of the speakers that they'll give like free templates and things that they're trying to answer for somebody. But yet I always kind of feel turned off by some of these talks because they're trying to give people answers that they've come up with in trying to solve their own problems. And yet we aren't like cookie cutters. Just because somebody is giving me 100 questions to ask myself about growing my YouTube channel, or here's the proper structure on how to create a hook. It doesn't mean that that's really going to be applicable and help solve my own problem. But what I want to get to is actually that the way that we respond to friends is that we shouldn't be answering their questions outright. If they really want help, we should be asking ourselves, what's a better question for them to be asking themselves? Because we can never convince somebody that we have the answer, or that if they have an opinion, we have a different opinion. Just arguing outright is not going to change their opinion. And we all know that, but yet we still do it. And what the psychology indicates that we should be asking the question so that they can ask themselves these questions, and then they can come up with an answer. And perhaps that answer is more in line with, it's going to help guide them. And so all of that is like a long-winded way of saying that I like this concept of, say, looking at your book as like a friend, because a friend should ask the right questions and help lead you to those questions. And I think that's exactly what your book does.
Oh, I love that. I do feel like at some point I tried to phrase it like a warm and wise friend. And I think it's different to be a smart friend or just a comforting friend, but to be warm and wise kind of in combination, I think describes what you're talking about. You don't want to have to be someone's therapist friend, but to return with a thoughtful question. I mean, one, it takes the burden off of you, but two, it gives your friend the chance to think about like, is there something, is my intuition off? Like, do I not have the support of my family and friends? There's one section called blockers in the first part of the book that I feel like if you needed like a quick 6-question sort of go-to for responding to friends, I feel like that's a really tidy set. Something you said about like sort of these templates or worksheets for answers reminds me of the survivorship bias, which is like, just because it worked for them, it doesn't mean it's going to work for you, because our world, aside from this one moment that they're talking about, I forgot what the example was, but is completely different. Like and so the idea that we would think like this template works for you, would work, kind of plug and play, is kind of a fascinating trick of the mind, in that like we want it to. We want there to be like this easy thing for you and I to plug and play. And maybe there is on TikTok, like maybe there is in some situations where you can like follow a template. I think it speaks to like, imagine someone in their interior world, everything they see throughout the day is just colored by those glass. Imagine someone's like farsighted and imagine you're nearsighted, right? It's just a completely different world. Or imagine you're tall and I'm short. Like the literal vantage point you have on the world. If you've ever been to a show and you're short, you can't see anything. And so I always try to remember that, which is like, if I'm giving you advice at this concert, or you're giving me advice at this concert and you're super tall and you're like, just look to the right. And I'm like, I can't see anything. It sort of reminds me of what you were saying, which is like, yeah, you might as well. I think it would be good to remember something like that. That's easy to bring to mind, something quite tangible, like someone's height or something, to remind you that like everyone's interior state is quite different and it's shaped by a lifetime of experiences.
The amount, it made me think in a broader context of the amount of searching that we tend to do as humans for our individual problems. I could just think of it like the easy one is like how to get rich. You type that into Google and you'll see all these people with books and courses trying to sell you their concept of how to get rich, how to make money. And yet it's very rare that I've heard of anybody really being able to, like, if you end up, the amount of $1,000 course, I bought so many $1,000 courses in my lifetime, and yet I can't think of any that have actually helped me to get to where I'm at. And I think a part of that is our desire, our natural tendency towards finding answers and not really asking ourselves, why do we desire this in the first place? And I think that's really, in a sense, what I sense that your book is really getting to is going back to this, is what is the question we should be asking? Is it how to get rich? Is it why do I want to make money? Is it solving some other emotional need that I have? Is it a childhood trauma? And then perhaps working on that instead of just trying to make money. I mean, money is nice and all, but if your desire to make money is wrapped up in an emotional trauma, at least like mine was, you're going to make money, a ton of money, that you won't know what to do with it. And you're still going to be broken inside, And so I think that goes back to that, making sure that we're asking the right questions, because there is not going to be any guru that you will ever find that is going to give you the answers that you're seeking. And that's really what I love about your book. It's rare that I give somebody so much praise on the podcast, but it really, like the concept of even your book, of the fact that ask this book any question, and it's not trying to give you an answer. And I just really love that perspective.
Thank you for all this is, it's so nice to hear. And I wasn't sure if it would make people feel disappointed because, most of the books out there do claim to give you something, an answer, a way, like 6 easy steps. You know what I mean? That's like typically you need like a hook like that. But what I was really trying to channel was something a little more playful, a little more, not magical, but it did need to feel in contrast to the seriousness of the topic of cognitive bias. Like I saw that people were in decision making, in life decisions, just like think about the last 3 friends that came to you with a question and then think about how they ended up making that decision. I felt like I saw like, okay, we got the spreadsheet people. They're doing like something on a document, whether it be lists or scoring things or using one of those frameworks you kind of talked about. And then there were the people who were just like sort of surveying all their friends, kind of maybe taking a little census of like, what would you do? Oh, you've done this. What would you do? And kind of like trying to offload the decision, but also get advice. And I think even on the very end of that spectrum, especially in certain cities, you have people, and I think in this world with so much uncertainty, so much like stuff happening that feels kind of existential, more and more people turning to like astrology or tarot, like even more sort of squishy, floaty ways to make decisions. I just felt like, gosh, could I take the more evidence-based, I don't want to say it's more, I thought it was more rigorous in terms of human behavior and put that into the more gushy format, not a fully bait and switch, but just to make it easier for people to use, which is what my job is as a designer, to make it easier for you to do X thing, get a ride, find the music you love, like find inspiration. So I'm glad that it feels like a little bit different, but also approachable is what I'm reading or hearing in between what you're saying. Because that was the hope, that it wouldn't be so, it would be a blend of these 2 things that exist in the world, but haven't existed in relationship to each other like that.
And so you take this approach from of understanding that we're in a society now where it seems like people are looking more abstractly to whether it's the universe, whether it's tarot, what's the specific hour and day that you were born. I think I met somebody who practices like human-centric design or something. And then they asked me like, okay, what's your birthday? What hour, do you know what hour you were born? And then it supposedly maps out your entire personality. And then you can use that as like a metric for, answering questions and what your life path is. And it's fascinating that we're having more and more of these aspects that people search for to help them kind of solve these issues. I find it interesting now that, especially with the rise of AI, I find myself asking, if I have a problem, I ask myself, what would AI do? What would ChatGPT say? And I find even like the fact that I've used it is I end up getting this concept of knowing what it would tell me and then kind of using that as a metric to guide me. But in your book, you take this approach of helping the user determine what question they want to be asking and then leading them to, in some sense, a cognitive bias or fallacy, as you mentioned. And I'm sure you've read the very dense book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. The first time I read that book, it probably took me 3 months of reading it every day. But my mind was blown. It's like the Holy Bible of behavioral economics. And that, as I understand, they were 2 of really like the first psychologists to really understand and map out what are all of these fallacies and biases that we're subject to that we're not even aware of. And I think probably one of the most famous one that most people are aware of is a fundamental attribution error, where when somebody does something, we tend to attribute whatever they do to their personality rather than circumstance. But say, if we cut somebody off in traffic it's because we're late to work, right? But if somebody else cuts us off, they're an asshole and we don't like that person, right? And so I'm curious, how did you come up with this concept of putting people on this track of having the question and then leading them to what's the relevant fallacy or bias? And to one little final thought on that is that I remember is that Daniel Kahneman stating that even though that they mapped out their fallacies and biases, they were still subject to them. So even having the awareness of them doesn't mean that you're immune to them at the same time.
That's the crux of it. And, you'll notice that I take care to not say this book will help you eliminate bias or delete whatever, like insert verb there. It's very much about sort of like if you've done therapy or any sort of psychotherapy, you know how there's like the exiled parts or your shadow side or even traits that you might be embarrassed about. But the way to sort of best work with those is to fully integrate them. Like, so if you're, I don't know, what's an example? If you're scared of, or perhaps maybe you're worried about being embarrassed, so you act a certain way to overcome that, like to truly face that embarrassment, you need to like listen to the part of you that is like, what part of you is like really, really ashamed about that? Like what could happen there? I wanted to do that with bias because I feel like there are also these like mental patterns that get us through our days, like what I was talking about our environment or every single decision we have to make in any moment. I feel like bias is this like unsung hero. It gets a lot of negative press or negative connotation, but without it, we would be stuck. I'm sure you learned in the book, like we would be paralyzed with information overload, decision overload, and we would literally be frozen in place. And so the idea that like these things have gotten us through, whether it's evolution or our day, and we're kind of trying to be like, ugh, like we're trying to get rid of them. I really wanted to flip that and help us like notice. So if it's the fundamental attribution error, the example you use, if Daniel Kahneman, I actually don't know what he would say about this since he's passed, but like, yes, he's aware of it. Yes, he cannot fully avoid it. But what would happen if he took the knowledge of fundamental attribution error and leaned into it? So the next time he met someone or noticed someone doing something, like he doubled down on in traffic, he created a whole story about where that person was going or something. I think there's really interesting things you can do with the knowledge of the bias differently than just storing it away as a fact. And so as you'll see in the spreads, I really try to expand them, maybe in a way that a social scientist who did the research could not, maybe true to the research. But as a designer who is human-centered, like end person-centered, I think it's really interesting because I feel the agency to like, okay, this is a thing. Like, let me stretch it in all sorts of ways and think about like, if you put it on backwards, if you put it on upside down, like this is how you could use it. And that's how those bias spreads work. Similar to like when you pull a tarot card. There's nothing wrong or right about, I actually don't know tarot that well, but like a 9 of Swords or the Queen card or whatever, they are open to interpretation. And I really wanted that for each bias. I wanted you to think, what could this mean in this moment?
You kind of gave me an answer without giving me the answer. But if I go back to that example of person cutting me off in traffic, and I think if you understand that this is something that happens, that we tend to blame that person, we see what they did as a character flaw and ours as circumstantial, then in that moment, I might recognize that I don't know the circumstance that led this person to cut me off. So I should not assume that it's because that they're a bad person. And I've actually unintentionally kind of done that more as I've grown and become an adult. There's aspects where or situations where, our prefrontal cortex just shuts down and our amygdala just takes over and we end up in that fight or flight mode if somebody does something that upsets us. And that can be really hard for us to take the knowledge of the fallacies and biases into an account. But if we try to practice this as a practice, then I think that can allow us to recognize that I shouldn't overreact in this way. Or if somebody does something to us that feels off and we don't like that person, we can take a step back. And in some ways, I would comfort myself by saying, oh, well, they have a childhood trauma. And so I forgive that person. I try to back off of assuming that they're a bad person.
What is going on in their interior that caused them to react that way?
Just to add on to that, there's these other biases as well. Like, you mentioned egocentric bias in the book, where we tend to overestimate our own perspective while we discount others' other views. So maybe we become aware that I tend to put more weight into my belief or my opinion rather than the opinion of somebody else, because I know what I know and I don't know what they don't know and what they do know. And so you're going to put more weight into your own belief. Or attentional bias, where we tend to focus on things that stand out to us, and that becomes the center of our attention. So I don't have a specific example for that, but I think you're onto something in that if we become aware of our fallacies and biases, they may not always be able to help us in every circumstance, but it can shift our thinking.
Yeah. And I think to your examples there, what I think is a broader change that I think will happen, I hope will happen, isn't that you sitting in traffic will remember, maybe you will, like best case scenario, you remembered to do that in the moment. I feel like that could be more therapy of being generous and empathetic. But what I hope is that in other situations, versus like a reaction to a situation where it's true, your gut, your knee jerk might just happen anyway. It could be that in a different situation, you're leading with the perspective of the fund. Like now that you've understood that knowledge, it's a different situation where perhaps it's a positive one. Like, wow, that person really went out of their way to do something nice for me. It wasn't that they were just having a good day, but they are a genuinely nice person or something. Like it could be just like you noticing something not happening to you and you thinking they must be in a rush. I think it's a more interesting example to think about how your behavior might change more passively in this proactive way than hoping that it will always change in the reactive way, because I feel like you could be let down because those are the hardest moments.
I wanted to move on into something that is a common fallacy. I don't know if there's a name for it, but we tend to put a lot of weight into external changes, like having a new job, a new city or relationship, as a means of solving deeper problems. But they really rarely ever seem to solve these problems. And so I'm curious why we tend to lean on external changes rather than internal. And I wonder if this is where your dog, Charlie, might be relevant.
For everyone listening who probably hasn't read the Charlie story, it's a little story about this big guy here. He's a 125-pound Great Pyrenees, which for those of you who can't see the video, it's a big white fluffy dog that resembles a polar bear, some people have said, or falcor, some people say. And the story is about how around the same time, I think post-pandemic, maybe a lot of people were itching for change, but I moved to New York City in the exact way that you talked about, hoping for kind of like a life reset or like an overhaul, a vibe shift, whatever you want to call it. But during the pandemic, I had also adopted Charlie. And a lot of people adopt dogs. I don't know if they think it will be life-changing, especially if it's an average-sized dog. And the story goes into it in a little bit more detail, but I sort of found that like, yes, moving to New York is a big change. People there are so different. The cities are, if you've been to both, like the cities are quite different, very nature based versus very loud. I don't know, arts and culture based. And despite all of that, like, you know what they say, like, wherever you go, there you are. It's like I was still me in New York City, and whatever I was hoping to leave was still there. And it was actually me adopting Charlie, who happens to be a very big, sort of eye-catching dog. And it wasn't specifically my bond with Charlie, although that is meaningful. And I think anyone who has a dog, The Doggist, or if you've read like The Friend by Sigrid Nunez, she talks about her relationship with her dog. Those are all meaningful. But for me, it was that every time I walk Charlie, I have to talk to like 10 strangers about the same 5 questions. Like, and it'll be, wow, is that a dog or a polar bear? And then they'll say, what kind is he? And then they'll say, how much does he weigh? And then it'll be like the same series of questions because he looks like that. Like I would ask that if it were me. And, I talk about this in the story, but the repetition of having to answer that day over day, whether I was on a phone call, whether it was first thing in the morning, whether it was raining, usually not raining, but like if I was in a bad mood or if I was in a good mood, if I was with other people in a rush, like I'm always having to answer these questions. Using that as like almost like a centering or a neutralizing, like a great sort of neutralizer to be like, oh yeah, they are seeing Charlie for the first time and he is big. I have just gotten used to it. Always helped to like pull me out of however far I've gotten along in my own mental like rabbit hole of my day, my life, my whatever stuff to be like, oh yeah, we're here on the street, walking a dog who looks like a polar bear. It's San Francisco or New York. And these people are full humans with questions and they want to know about this dog. And that like daily change, the lesson of the story, there's a couple of them, but the idea that if you can make a change in your life, it could be a move that elicits a daily change like that pulls you out of your interior space, that kind of forces you to reckon with like what's going on in here. I think that's much more meaningful than simply up and moving to New York and then plopping down in a similar apartment in a similar neighborhood because you like certain things and hang out with certain people. That's what I found.
You said it well in that we often seek to change our environment and I think it feels exciting to moving to a new city or having a new job. And you get all that dopamine because you don't really know what to expect. It's like pressing a reset button. And yet it's like the baggage still comes with us, right? And I think what you're proposing is that real growth in improving our problems and situation isn't really running away, but it's trying to face honestly what we've been avoiding on the inside.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think you can absolutely do that when you move. I would just be intentional about, giving some thought to with this big change, what can I like sort of bundle with that to make sure my day to day changes? And it could be the people you interact with. It could be your job or the type of street you live on. But I would then try to hone into the daily rituals, the details, because those are what's going to come up so frequently. But one other thing about the Charlie story is that I can't remember exactly how many biases were in that story, but of course there was something about the egocentric bias, the fundamental attribution error and things like that. But instead of telling the story about traffic and driving, I didn't want to just tell a story about one bias. I wanted to tell a human story that you would hopefully remember and you would intuitively connect with. And then I wanted you to sort of reverse map or understand or dig deeper into the biases separately. And I don't know why that was so important for me. I just feel like the canonical examples of bias, like you've heard the World War II fighter jets being shot down. Like I feel like when people talk about survivorship bias, they always talk about the jets that returned home with all the bullets in them. It's like, what am I going to do with that? That's sort of like the template answer. And I kind of purposefully made that connection more opaque. So you wouldn't just, even in the Charlie story, I say, don't, it's not to say you should adopt a big dog. It asks you to then go from here and make it fit for you. And so again, like maybe it's the designer in me, but I really wanted to start with like, there's a kernel in each of these stories. I'm not saying you should just plug and play that, but like really take the time to try to like, kernel was maybe the wrong seed, like plant that seed and then see what grows from there.
Right. And I think what, as an overarching philosophy here is that tiny, rituals, habits, they make a massive impact on our overall life that we don't really think about on a day-to-day perspective. And I know there's authors like James Clear who wrote Atomic Habits, and his whole thing is that these tiny habits can lead to massive life shifts over time. And I know in your book you also mentioned Rick Rubin, who's is huge on rituals as a means of providing clarity and purpose. And I think too often we look at trying to solve these big questions or trying to get these answers to these things that are kind of bothering us without really asking yourselves, are there like some little tiny things that I can do in my day that could perhaps lead me down the path that I'm looking to go down that aren't so jarring as to be emotionally distressful of trying to make a big decision that we stress out on.
Mm-hmm. You could even think of them as little experiments. And I know it doesn't feel as satisfying to be like, okay, today I'm going to take a different route. But like you would be surprised if you're paying attention. In the question section, this exactly what you said is why I wanted to create those two spectrums. You might, in the timing section, you might have seen there was a girl kind of, I don't actually know what the one end, it might just be her head. And you can kind of see that she's rushing towards the end of the spectrum. And the spectrum is it an eventual question or is it urgent? And the other one is it every day or once in a lifetime? And you'll end up seeing these two by twos, like little these four boxes that you get when you combine the two spectrums. And I think that we spend a lot of time, exactly like you said, on the two ends of the spectrum, urgent and once in a lifetime. And I think that what that means is we overlook the other ends of like eventual or everyday. And so the things that happen every day, like we spend a lot of time eating meals. We spend a lot of time perhaps on our phone or watching TV or even just like spending money. Like we might think of how can I make this big career change, but we don't think about how do I spend my small bits of money or time each day. And to help people make that association that is the same question, that's exactly what the question flow is doing. Like, okay, you're out here, like, let's bring it back to here, because people then get paralyzed in like the vastness, the bigness of the question. And then it has to be like the perfect time or the perfect place to then take that big leap.
And so on this last perspective, I want to, or this last theme I'd like to explore in relation to these questions that, we're asking. What is the way that we should be asking ourselves these questions? And I say that in relation to like, is it journaling? Because I know a lot of people struggle to even sit with a question long enough to even like let it ponder or let it stew. So are you a proponent of journaling and writing things down?
Yeah, I think journaling can be hard. I think it just depends on what works for you. So if you find yourself drawn towards journaling, perhaps you identify as more of an introvert. I think some people, journaling is just a conversation with yourself. I want folks to use the book in relationship with other people. And there's a card deck, a companion card deck that's coming out with it to kind of encourage you to use it in that way. But one reason why I think it's important to use it with someone else, and it could be just anybody. It doesn't have to be like a close friend. In fact, it could be helpful to use it with someone who you don't feel strongly like see eye to eye with, just because everyone's biases are different. And I feel like I've heard this metaphor during COVID for PPE, but I kind of think it's a good metaphor for biases, where the Swiss cheese method, I think what they were describing is that if you layer a bunch of Swiss cheese slices, the individual holes in each slice will even out. So hopefully you don't have like something sliding through. With biases, it's the same thing. Like if we talk about a situation, like should I quit my job or should I move? The perspectives that you have because of exactly what we were talking about, your whole lifetime of experiences and your biased point of view will just be different than mine. And so you can have a conversation with yourself that is good. You can start there to feel clear on your own, like this is where I'm beginning. But if you can talk it over with someone and stay quite open to the questions that they're asking back, I do feel like you'll get to a whole different place rather than kind of there's like a local maxima that you hit of your own understanding.
Right. And I think that's also just the incredible power of AI that we have. And I think we're in this era. I mean, we have AI and it's capable of so much. And yet I think the knowledge about what you can use AI for. And I think it's easy if you have a job and you're able to think about, oh, let me ask ChatGPT this question that's specific about my job, right? And you form that neural connection of relying on AI for that. And I personally found ChatGPT to be incredibly useful as a mentor. And I've even uploaded all of my journals for the past 10 years. And I've journaled like every week at a very consistent journaling method where every day I use this app called exist.io and I rate my day 1 through a 9. And then I say generally what happened. And then at the end of the week, I do this weekly reflection and I import everything that happened in that week. And then I ask myself, what are the emotional scars? What are the things that bring something up? Is it negative? Is it positive? And then I kind of go into that. And then I'm able to use AI as a means of analyzing that from a different angle. And part of the template that I give to me are what are questions that I should ask myself that I haven't thought to ask myself about the experiences over the past week. And I found that to be incredibly profound at shifting my own perspective. And so I think you mentioned journaling and your book, and maybe it's also talking with a friend. And maybe I think there's this incredible power of being able to use AI as a means of helping you in the same way understand what questions you should be asking.
Yes, absolutely. And I love that example of AI because the way I like to think about what role or space can AI fill in my life is what am I bad at and what is AI good at versus things that I'm already good at. Yeah, sure, it can replace Google or yeah, sure, it can book the restaurant for me as often you see in the ads. It's like doing all your online chores. It's like, okay, sure, but what is that getting back? What is that getting me back? I spend more time on my phone, I love this idea of like AI can process or has this bird's eye view, or it doesn't get tired of like reading walls of text, like not to say your journal entries are walls of text, but it can do this really well and give you the vantage point that you wouldn't be able to do because, you're a human. And I also feel like most people overlook the intentionality of prompting with like, this is the role you're going to take, or these are the things you should know to begin with, because then it's so powerful. It's so intentional. It's not just like what I worry that's going to happen in decision making with Gen AI is that people will just offload one and done. Like, should I, any of the questions you would ask the book, should I quit my job? And then it might give you some questions back. It might give you some considerations, but it doesn't show you everything else outside the little lens that it has been sort of programmed to show. So I'm really excited about like, how can people say, do exactly what you're doing, or take something from my book and then be in conversation with AI to really extend that. I think that's much more meaningful than just like, hey, ChatGPT, tell me what to do in this situation. Tell me what I should consider.
Yeah, and I think not to undermine your book, or any book for that matter, because reading is like exercise for the mind. And just using AI, I mean, there's already been studies showing that we're having a drop in critical thinking and an ability to problem solve for ourselves when we're becoming overly reliant on AI. And even though maybe 2 years ago, there was this whole thing about prompt engineering that was super big. And then, okay, there's that. But then there is this other argument made that, well, in 2 years, AI is going to be so good that you won't need a prompt engineer. It will just understand what you need and give you what you want. And that's turned out thus far to not be true. That the value of the output you can get from AI is 100% determined on the value of the input that you give it. And in order to give it the right input, you have to know what questions to ask it. And that is incredibly important. And I think that's one thing that your book teaches us, is to know what questions should we be asking ourselves? Should we be asking our friends? Should we be asking AI for that matter?
Yeah. And if we can front load all of our thought in the first part, like whatever you would call it, like priming the table, mise en place, and let AI do all the hard work, even better. But I think we should not overlook exactly what you were saying, the critical thinking that goes into what are you going to ask this incredibly powerful machine to do? And in design, we kind of think of it as like creative direction or art direction. Like we may be doing less of like the rote task of designing the features or executing the actual keystrokes and mouse movements, but becomes even more important to have taste or a point of view or style. And I think the version of that I've been thinking about for decision making is knowing what you value, knowing what it means to like make decisions that are coherent with either who you want to be or what you envision for yourself. Like so much more should be going into the front loading as you sort of create your prompt template, if you will.
On that note, I feel like we've probably spent as much time as we can spend on questions about questions that can keep a user's interest. And again, I love the whole premise of the book, the title, the Ask This Book a Question. It's very unique, and it's a whole different perspective that I think I'm definitely going to buy a handful of copies, and it's going to be one of the books that I give out to people who come to me looking for me to answer questions for them. But before we wrap up, I'd love to leave listeners with something kind of practical. If someone could walk away from this episode and just ask themselves one meaningful question today, say something that could change how they see things. I'm curious. I know it's a hard question to answer, but what would you suggest they ask?
I think what the whole book beginning asks is, why is this your question? Like, why are you asking it? Why are you stuck? Why is this here for you now? So it's kind of an annoying why back, but I think that if you could start to journal about that, I personally like to doodle about that. Like sometimes words only get you so far. But if you could ask yourself why you even haven't moved on from this question from when it first arrived. And you could imagine like filling in a scene of you sitting there. What is everything else around you in that moment? I think that's a pretty good question back to yourself and a place to begin.
And for our listeners who want to explore more on Vicki's ideas, her book, Ask This Book a Question, will be available on April 8th, 2025. And you can find links to pre-order it along with Vicki's website and social media in the show notes, or visit her website at vickitan.com. That's VICKITAN.com. Thank you for joining us. To our listeners, thank you for tuning in for another episode of Mind Hack. If you enjoyed this conversation, please consider subscribing, leaving a review, or sharing the episode with someone who might benefit from these insights. Until next time, I'm Cody McLean, and this has been Mind Hack.